One pioneering psychologist made a discovery that has never been widely shared, and it has nothing to do with how to bounce back from trauma. He found that the deepest phase a deeply feeling person passes through after being broken down by a manipulative partner does not simply heal them. It either wipes out their sensitivity for good or transforms it into a level of awareness that is genuinely unprecedented. Within his clinical notes, this pioneer recorded case after case of sensitive individuals who had been thoroughly ground down by one manipulative partner after another, and who eventually arrived at what he called the final stage of empathic development. These were not stories of ordinary recovery. They were stories of complete psychological metamorphosis, where the person came out the other side carrying what he called integrated shadow awareness, a kind of inner immunity to every form of emotional manipulation. He considered the discovery dangerous because the people who reached this final stage often became unrecognizable to those who had known them before. They had cultivated what he described as sovereign empathy, the ability to feel at profound depths while remaining psychologically untouchable. And he had rarely seen this level of consciousness in his lifetime. Today, I want to walk you through this most hazardous finding about the final stage of the deeply feeling after narcissistic abuse, and why he argued that this devastating experience either erases sensitivity entirely or transmutes it into what he called the archetypal wounded healer, a form of awareness that moves past both victimhood and survival. The case that first brought this phenomenon into clear view began in 1928 with one woman he referred to in his private papers only as a single letter, a 34-year-old woman whose deeply feeling nature had drawn a long line of progressively destructive, manipulative partners into her life. When she first walked into his office, she was, in his own written words, psychically dissolved. Her sense of self had been so thoroughly worn away that she could hardly tell the difference between her own emotions and the emotions of the people standing next to her. But during the next 2 years, he documented something extraordinary. She did not simply get better. She went through what he described as an alchemical transformation through shadow integration. Where she had once been porous to every emotional wave, she developed what he called conscious permeability, the ability to choose precisely what to absorb from another person and what to deflect. In his notes, he recorded the words, "She has achieved something I once thought impossible. Complete empathic sovereignty. She can sit in the depths of another person's suffering without being swallowed by it. She can sense deceit with almost supernatural accuracy. Most remarkably, she has become immune to manipulation while keeping her full capacity for genuine compassion." The transformation was so absolute that he questioned whether she was still the same person at all. Her family felt the shift instantly. Where she had once been the emotional anchor of every gathering, she now set limits that seemed immovable. Old acquaintances accused her of going cold or growing distant, but he saw something deeper happening. She had reached the ultimate stage of empathic development that he had only theorized could one day be reached. He wrote that her eyes had changed. He wrote that they held depths he had never seen in another person, as if she had stared into the darkest layer of human nature and emerged not broken, but wise. He understood that narcissistic abuse creates what he called the empathic crucible, a psychological pressure cooker that either destroys sensitivity completely or forges it into something far more refined and far more powerful. The key was to understand what he called shadow integration through forced individuation. During narcissistic abuse, the deeply feeling person is systematically forced to look directly at their own shadow, the parts of themselves they have disowned, hidden, or refused to recognize. The manipulator, he wrote, acts as an unconscious shadow mirror, throwing the deeply feeling person's own capacity for manipulation, self-interest, and emotional detachment right back at them. He documented in his case files that sensitive people typically endure what he called the 3 deaths during this process. The first death is the death of their idealized self-image as purely kind and endlessly giving. The second death is the death of their belief that love alone can redeem anyone. The third and most pivotal death is the death of their need for outside approval to feel that they are worthy of being loved. The deeply feeling person, he insisted, must face their own shadow, not through gentle self-reflection, but through a brutal confrontation with their own capacity for darkness. The manipulator unknowingly serves as the catalyst for this essential inner work, he wrote. He identified that the people who survive this crucible go on to develop what he called integrated empathy, the ability to feel without the compulsive need to fix what they feel in another person, the ability to understand without automatically taking responsibility for the other person's choices, and the ability to love without losing their own center. And this is not emotional detachment, it is emotional mastery. The inner shifts he observed were significant. These individuals kept their sensitivity in full, but added what he described as a conscious filtering capacity. They could sense everything happening around them and still choose what to actually process. He noted that this was similar to the abilities of advanced meditation masters, but achieved through trauma rather than through spiritual discipline. He wrote, "The manipulator in their unconscious role as a shadow teacher forces the deeply feeling person to develop the psychological muscles they never even knew they had." Stay with me. Because what he observed next is the part most people miss. He discovered something that troubled him deeply about the people who reached this final stage. They often ended up isolated and not by their own choosing. It happened out of necessity. The very transformation that made them psychologically formidable also made them fundamentally incompatible with people who were still living in unconscious patterns. He documented that these evolved individuals could no longer tolerate what he called psychological unconsciousness in others. They could feel it instantly when someone was acting from ego projection or from a hidden place of manipulation. This created what he called the consciousness gap, an unbridgeable divide between those who had integrated their shadow and those who were still blind to it. His patient described this experience herself. She said it felt as if she could now see the psychological machinery of every person around her, their defenses, their projections, their hidden agendas, and it was as if everything had become transparent to her. But this new clarity had cost her nearly every relationship she had once held dear. He realized this was the concealed danger of this kind of evolution. These individuals had developed what he called archetypal sight, the ability to see past the social masks people wear and into the deeper psychological patterns that drive almost every human behavior. And while this made them incredibly effective as healers and guides, it also made ordinary social interaction feel nearly impossible. He wrote, "They have eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge, and like all those who taste that fruit, they can never go back to the garden of unconscious innocence." The most disturbing part of this whole phenomenon was that many people instinctively feared these evolved individuals. He noted that others could feel it, even on a subconscious level, that these people could see straight through the psychological armor they had spent a lifetime building. This created what he called the prophet's isolation, the experience of being rejected, not for being wrong, but for seeing too much. He documented cases where families, friends, and even other therapists grew visibly uneasy around these individuals, sensing the piercing insight without being able to articulate what they were reacting to. Through his extensive case studies, he identified 4 distinct paths that the deeply feeling take after narcissistic abuse, and only one of those paths leads to the final stage of development. The 4th type, the one I am about to describe, is the type that absolutely changes everything. Type 1, the dissolved empath. These individuals never reclaim their sense of self. He observed that they become psychic ghosts, present in body, but not truly living. They lose the ability to tell their own emotions apart from the emotions of others, and they exist in a perpetual state of inner turmoil. He noted that these individuals often develop what he called a perpetual victim consciousness, repeatedly drawing the same kind of abusive dynamics back into their lives. Type 2, the armored empath. These individuals protect themselves by completely shutting down their sensitivity. He described them as having built psychological fortresses around their hearts. While they successfully avoid further abuse, they also lose access to their original gift entirely. They often become cynical and emotionally detached, essentially choosing safety over authenticity. Type 3, the wounded healer. These individuals transmute their trauma into a drive to help others. While this is commendable, he warned that this type often stays stuck in what he called compulsive rescue patterns. They have learned to set limits, but they still draw their sense of worth from being needed. He observed, they have not fully integrated their shadow and remain vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation. Type 4, the sovereign empath. This is the final stage. These are deeply feeling people who have achieved a complete integration of their sensitivity with their shadow elements. He wrote, they have become what I can only describe as conscious vessels, able to hold the full spectrum of human experience without being corrupted or depleted by it. He identified specific traits of sovereign empaths. They can feel another person's emotions without taking responsibility for them. They can detect manipulation instantly and still respond with compassion rather than anger. They maintain limits without walls, and they have developed what he called archetypal wisdom, an understanding of human behavior at the deepest psychological level. The key difference, he noted, is that sovereign empaths have fully embraced their own shadow. They no longer project their disowned darkness outward onto others, and this is what makes them immune to the psychological hooks that manipulators depend on. He documented several dangers that come with reaching the final stage of this development, and these dangers made him openly question whether this kind of evolution was worth the price. The isolation factor. He observed that sovereign empaths often lived in profound isolation. They had outgrown the psychological level of most people around them. He wrote, it is like adults trying to relate to children, where the gap in consciousness creates an unbridgeable divide. Many reported feeling like strangers in their own families and in their own communities. The burden of sight. These individuals could no longer unsee the psychological patterns driving human behavior. He noted that they often experienced what he called archetypal fatigue, a deep exhaustion from constantly witnessing the same unconscious patterns playing out in human relationships. They learned to predict relationship failures years before they happened, to see straight through political manipulation, and to detect emotional patterns long before they fully surfaced. The responsibility weight. He documented that many sovereign empaths felt crushed by their own abilities. They could see clear solutions to other people's problems, but they had learned that unsolicited insight is rarely welcomed. This created what he called a complex of being disbelieved, the painful situation of carrying accurate psychological insights that others reject or simply cannot understand. The authenticity demand, perhaps the most challenging of all. He observed that these individuals could no longer tolerate inauthenticity in themselves or in anyone around them. They had become what he called truth sensors, immediately detecting the moment someone was being false or was acting from a hidden motive. And this made maintaining ordinary social relationships extremely difficult. He wrote, they have achieved psychological mastery, but at the cost of normal human connection. They have become bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms, but bridges are walked upon, never embraced. The most dangerous aspect he identified was what he called archetypal possession. Some deeply feeling people became so identified with their role as healers or truth tellers that they lost touch with their own basic humanity. He developed what he called the Shadow Integration Protocol, specifically for deeply feeling people recovering from narcissistic abuse. This was not traditional therapy. He described it as psychological alchemy, a process of transforming the lead of trauma into the gold of wisdom. Stage 1. Shadow acknowledgement. He insisted that these individuals must first acknowledge their own capacity for manipulation, selfishness, and cruelty. You cannot integrate what you refuse to own. This involves recognizing how their sensitivity may have been quietly used to control others, how their victimhood may have been weaponized, and how their outward goodness may have been a mask hiding deeper psychological needs. Stage 2, projection withdrawal. He taught that these individuals must systematically withdraw their projections from the manipulator. This means recognizing that the manipulator's grandiosity actually reflected their own disowned desire for recognition, that the manipulator's manipulation reflected their own subtle controlling behaviors, and that the manipulator's lack of empathy reflected their own hidden emotional numbness. Stage 3, boundary alchemy. Rather than building walls, he taught what he called conscious permeability, the ability to choose moment by moment what to absorb and what to deflect. This involves developing what he termed empathic discernment, feeling without fixing, understanding without rescuing, and loving without ever losing the self. Stage 4, archetypal alignment. He believed the final stage involved aligning with what he called the wounded healer archetype, accepting that their suffering had prepared them for a specific role inside the larger field of human experience. This is not about becoming a professional healer. It is about embodying the integration of wisdom and compassion that he believed was essential for human evolution. He wrote specific practices for each stage, including what he called shadow dialoguing, where a person consciously converses with the parts of themselves they had disowned. Empathic fasting, where a person deliberately chooses periods of emotional non-absorption. And archetypal meditation, where a person connects with the deeper patterns that govern human behavior. The key insight he emphasized was that these individuals must stop trying to return to who they were before the abuse. The chrysalis cannot become a caterpillar again. He wrote, "The goal is not recovery, but metamorphosis." He studied historical figures to understand what determined whether a deeply feeling person achieved sovereign awareness or was destroyed by their own sensitivity. His analysis revealed patterns that applied directly to modern recovery from narcissistic abuse. Success pattern 1, the psychologist himself. He revealed in his private writings that his own psychological theories emerged from surviving what he called psychological persecution by authority figures who tried to manipulate his deeply feeling nature. He wrote, "My tormentors unknowingly became my greatest teachers, forcing me to develop the psychological tools that would become my life's work." He achieved sovereign empathy by refusing to become bitter, by studying his tormentors as psychological specimens rather than as personal enemies, and by transforming his insights into service for others. His method became the template for this kind of integration. Success pattern 2, historically documented cases. He documented several patients who achieved similar integration. One, a composer who survived an abusive marriage, channeled her trauma into music that he described as archetypal, speaking directly to the deeper layers of human experience. Another, a physician, developed unprecedented diagnostic abilities after surviving psychological manipulation by colleagues. The common thread he identified was their ability to see their abuse as an initiation rather than as victimization. They understood their experience as preparation for a larger purpose rather than as random cruelty. Failure pattern, the gifted who did not integrate. He also studied historical cases of deeply feeling people who were destroyed by their sensitivity. He noted that they typically fell into one of two traps. Either they remained identified as victims, using their trauma as their primary identity, or they became what he called wounded wounders, using their psychological insights to manipulate and control others. He wrote, "The difference between the sovereign empath and the destroyed empath is not the severity of their trauma, but their willingness to transform poison into medicine." The failure pattern always involved what he called shadow rejection, the conscious or unconscious refusal to acknowledge their own capacity for the same behaviors that had wounded them. He recognized that sovereign empaths needed entirely different types of relationships than typical deeply feeling people. He developed what he called consciousness compatibility theory to help them find authentic connections. Recognition signals. He identified that other evolved individuals could be recognized by their ability to discuss psychology without becoming defensive, by their comfort with paradox and contradiction, by their lack of need to be right or superior, and by what he called archetypal humor, the ability to find lightness in the darkest human patterns, safe relationship characteristics. He noted that healthy relationships for sovereign empaths involve mutual respect for psychological boundaries, comfortable silence without the need to fill space with chatter, the ability to discuss shadow aspects without judgment, and what he termed conscious intimacy, connection based on authentic self-revelation rather than projection. Community building strategies. He recommended that sovereign empaths seek others who had undergone similar transformative experiences, not necessarily narcissistic abuse, but any experience that forced rapid psychological evolution. He noted that trauma survivors, spiritual seekers who had faced their shadow, and individuals who had survived major life transitions often became compatible companions. He warned against trying to maintain relationships with unconscious individuals out of guilt or obligation. The butterfly cannot pretend to still be a caterpillar, he wrote. Attempting to do so serves no one and dishonors the transformation itself. He also recommended what he called archetypal service, where evolved deeply, feeling people use their refined abilities to serve the larger field of human experience through teaching, healing, creating, or simply modeling integrated consciousness. He documented that the transformation from wounded, deeply feeling person to sovereign, deeply feeling person follows what he called the 5 metamorphoses, and each is marked by specific inner shifts and challenges. Metamorphosis 1, the dissolution, occurs during active abuse, when the previous identity of the deeply feeling person completely breaks down. He noted that this feels like psychological death, but it is actually ego dissolution preparing for rebirth. The person experiences what he called blessed disintegration, the destruction of false self-concepts. Metamorphosis 2, the descent, comes after the abuse, when the person enters what he termed a voluntary underworld journey. They must face their own shadow, acknowledge their own participation in the dynamic, and confront their deepest fears about their worth and their lovability. He noted, this stage often involves what appears to be depression, but is actually psychological composting. Metamorphosis 3, the integration. The person begins consciously choosing which aspects of their shadow to embrace and which to transform. He called this selective shadow incorporation. They develop the ability to feel their anger without becoming cruel, to acknowledge their selfishness without becoming manipulative, and to own their power without becoming controlling. Metamorphosis 4, the emergence. The sensitivity returns, but in a refined form. He documented that people at this stage could feel others' emotions, but were not compelled to fix them. They could detect manipulation, but responded with compassion rather than anger. They could love deeply without losing their center. Metamorphosis 5, the sovereignty. The final stage he observed was the development of what he called archetypal consciousness, the ability to see beyond individual psychology to the larger patterns governing human behavior. These individuals had become what he termed conscious bridges between the personal and the transpersonal realms. He noted that each metamorphosis typically took 6 to 18 months, with the entire process requiring 3 to 7 years of conscious work. However, he emphasized that the timeline varied greatly based on the individual's willingness to face their shadow and their commitment to true integration rather than just surface healing. He identified several specific traps that could derail this transformation, and he warned that avoiding these pitfalls was crucial for reaching true sovereignty, the spiritual superiority trap. He warned that some deeply feeling people, after glimpsing their evolved abilities, became what he called spiritually grandiose, believing their trauma had made them more enlightened than everyone else. True sovereignty includes profound humility. He wrote, "The moment one believes they are beyond shadow, they are possessed by it." The perpetual healing trap. Some became addicted to transformation itself, constantly seeking new healing modalities rather than integrating their actual gains. He called this therapeutic materialism, the habit of treating healing as consumption rather than embodiment. The isolation addiction trap. While some isolation was necessary for integration, he warned against using psychological evolution as an excuse for avoiding all human connection. The sovereign, deeply feeling person serves consciousness through engagement, not through withdrawal. The revenge trap. He observed that some use their evolved psychological insights to subtly manipulate or punish the people who had hurt them. True integration transforms the desire for revenge into compassion for the unconscious. He wrote that the maintenance practice he recommended was what he called daily shadow check-ins, where a person regularly examines their own motivations, projections, and emotional reactions to make sure they remain conscious of their own psychological processes. His final insight about sovereign empaths was perhaps his most profound. He believed they represented an evolutionary leap in human consciousness, essential for humanity's psychological development.